Hi, boys and girls. Today I am going to read the first chapter and the second chapter of Number the Stars by Lois Lowry. Chapter 1. Why are you running? I'll race you to the corner, Ellen. Anne-Marie adjusted the thick leather back on her back so that her school books balanced evenly. Ready? She looked at her best friend. Ellen made a face. No, she said, laughing. You know I can't beat you. My legs aren't as long. Can't we just walk like civilized people? She was stocky, a 10-year-old, unlike lanky Anne-Marie. We have to practice for the athletic meet on Friday. I know. I'm going to win the girls' race this week. I was second last week, but I've been practicing every day. Come on, Ellen, Anne-Marie pleaded, eyeing the distance to the next corner of the Copenhagen street. Please? Ellen hesitated, then nodded and shifted her own rucksack of books against her shoulders. Oh, all right. Ready, she said. Go! Shouted Anne-Marie, and the two girls were off racing along the residential sidewalk. Anne-Marie's silvery blonde hair flew against her, and Ellen's dark pigtails bounced against her shoulders. Wait for me! Wailed little Christy, left behind, but the two older girls weren't listening. Anne-Marie outdistanced her friend quickly, even though one of her shoes came untied, and she sped along the street of Ossenbragen, past the small shops and cafes of her neighborhood here in the northeast Copenhagen. Laughing, she skirted an elderly lady in black who carried a shopping bag made of string. A young woman pushing a baby in a carriage moved aside to make way. The corner was just ahead. Anne-Marie looked up, panting just as she reached the corner. Her laughter stopped. Her heart seemed to skip a beat. Halt, the soldier ordered in a stern voice. The German word was as familiar as it was frightening. Anne-Marie had heard it often enough before, but it had never been directed at her until now. Behind her, Ellen also slowed and stopped. Far back, little Christy was prodding along, her face in a pout because the girls hadn't waited for her. Anne-Marie stared up. There were two of them that met, two helmets, two sets of cold eyes glaring at her, and four tall, shiny boots planted firmly on the sidewalk, blocking her path to home. And it meant two rifles gripped in the hands of the soldiers. She stared at the rifles first, then finally she looked into the face of the soldier who had ordered her to halt. Why are you running? The harsh voice asked. His Danish was very poor. 3 years, Amory thought with contempt. 3 years they've been in our country, and still they can't speak our language? I was racing with my friend, she answered politely. We have races at school every Friday. And, well, I want to do well, so I. Her voice trailed away. Sentence unfinished. Don't talk too much, she told herself. Just answer them, that's all. She glanced back. Ellen was motionless on the sidewalk a few yards behind her. Farther back, Christy was still sulking and walking slowly toward the corner. Nearby, a woman had come to the doorway of a shop and was standing silently watching. One of the soldiers, the taller one, moved toward her. Anne-Marie recognized him as the one that she and Ellen always called in whispers the giraffe. Because of his height and the long neck that extended from his stiff collar, he and his partner were always on the corner. He prodded the corner of her backpack with the stock of his rifle. Anne-Marie trembled. What is in here? He asked loudly. From the corner of her eye, she saw the shopkeeper move quietly back into the shadows of the doorway out of sight. School books? She answered truthfully. Are you a good student? The soldier asked. He seemed to be sneering. Yes. What's your name? Anne-Marie Johansson. Your friend? Is she a good student too? He was looking beyond her, at Ellen, who hadn't moved. Anne-Marie looked back too, and saw that Ellen's face, usually rosy-cheeked, was pale, and her dark eyes were wide. She nodded at the soldier. "Better than me," she said. "What is her name?" "Ellen." "And who is this?" he asked, looking at Anne-Marie's side. Christy had appeared there suddenly, scowling at everyone. "My little sister." She reached down for Christy's hand, but Christy, always stubborn, refused it and put her hands on her hips defiantly. The soldier reached down and stroked her little sister's short, tangled curls. "Stand still, Christy," Anne-Marie ordered silently, praying that somehow the obstinate 5-year-old would receive the message. But Christy reached up and pushed the soldier's hand away. "Don't!" she said loudly. Both soldiers began to laugh. They spoke to each other in rapid German that Anne-Marie couldn't understand. "She is pretty, like my own little girl," the tall one said in a more pleasant voice. Anne-Marie tried to smile politely. "Go home, all of you. Go study your school books. And don't run. You look like hoodlums when you run." The two soldiers turned away. Quickly, Anne-Marie reached down again and grabbed her sister's hand before Christy could resist. Hurrying the little girl along, she rounded the corner. In a moment, Ellen was beside her. They walked quickly, not speaking, with Christy between them, toward the large apartment building where both families lived. When they were almost home, Ellen whispered suddenly, "I was so scared." "Me too," Anne-Marie whispered back. As they entered the building, both girls looked straight ahead toward the door. They did it purposely, so that they would not catch the eyes or the attention of the two more soldiers who stood with their guns on this corner as well. Christy scurried ahead of them through the door, chattering about the pictures she was bringing home from kindergarten to show Mama. For Christy, the soldiers were simply part of the landscape, something that had always been there. On every corner, as unimportant as lampposts, throughout her remembered life. "Are you going to tell your mother?" Ellen asked Anne-Marie as they trudged together up the stairs. "I'm not. My mother would be upset." "No, I won't either. Mama would probably scold me for running on the street." She said goodbye to Ellen on the second floor where Ellen lived and continued on the third, practicing in her mind a cheerful greeting for her mother, a smile, a description of today's spelling test in which she had done well. But it was too late. Christy had gotten there first. And he poked Anne-Marie's book bag with his gun, and then he grabbed my hair. Christy was chattering as she took off her sweater in the center of the apartment living room. "But I wasn't scared. Anne-Marie was, and Ellen was too, but not me." Mrs. Johansson rose quickly from her chair by the window where she had been sitting. Mrs. Rosen, Ellen's mother, was there too, in the opposite chair. They had been having coffee together, as they did many afternoons. Of course, it wasn't real coffee, though the mothers still called it that, having coffee. There had been no real coffee in Copenhagen since the beginning of the Nazi occupation, not even any real tea. The mothers sipped at hot water flavored with herbs. "Anne-Marie, what happened? What is Christy talking about?" her mother asked anxiously. "Where's Ellen?" Mrs. Rosen had a frightened look. "Ellen's in your apartment. She didn't realize you were here," Anne-Marie explained. "Don't worry. It wasn't anything. It was the two soldiers who stand on the corner of Osbergade. You've seen them. You know, the tall one with the long neck and the one that looks like a silly giraffe." She told her mother, Mrs. Rosen, of the incident, trying to make it sound humorous and unimportant, but their uneasy looks didn't change. "I slapped his hand and she shouted at him," Christy announced importantly. "No, she didn't, Mama," Anne-Marie reassured her mother. "She's exaggerating as she always does." Mrs. Johansson moved to the window and looked down the street below. The Copenhagen neighborhood was quiet. It looked the same as always, people coming and going from shops, children at play, and the soldiers on the corner. She spoke in a low voice to Ellen's mother. They must be edgy because of the latest resistance incidents. Did you read in Die Freie Dansk about the bombings in Hilderod and Nuremberg? Although she pretended to be absorbed in the unpacking her school books, Amory listened, and she knew what her mother was referring to. Die Freie Dansk and the Free Danes was an illegal newspaper. Peter Nielsen brought it to them occasionally, carefully folded and hidden among ordinary books and papers, and Mama always burned it after she and Papa had read it. But Anne-Marie heard Mama and Papa talk, sometimes at night, about the news that they received that way. The news of sabotage against the Nazis, bombs hidden and exploded in the factories that produced war materials, and industrial railroad lines damaged so that the goods couldn't be transported. And she knew what resistance meant. Papa had explained when she overheard the word and asked. The resistance fighters were Danish people who no one who knew because they were very secret and who were determined to bring harm to the Nazis however they could. They damaged the German trucks and cars and bombed their factories. They were very brave. Sometimes they were caught and killed. I must go speak to Ellen, Mrs. Rosen said, moving toward the door. You girls walk in a different way to school tomorrow. Promise me, Anne-Marie. And Ellen will promise too. We will, Mrs. Rosen. But what does it matter? There are German soldiers on every corner. They will remember your faces, Mrs. Rosen said, turning in the doorway to the hall. It is important to be one of the crowd always. Be one of the many. Be sure that they will never have a reason to remember your face. She disappeared into the hall and closed the door behind her. He'll remember my face, Mama, Christy announced happily, because he said I look like his little girl. He said I was pretty. If he has such a pretty little girl, why doesn't he go back to her like a good father? Mrs. Johansson murmured, stroking Christy's cheek. Why doesn't he go back to his own country? Mama, is there anything to eat? Anne-Marie asked, hoping to take her mother's mind away from the soldiers. Take some bread and give a piece to your sister. With butter? Christy asked hopefully. No butter, her mother replied. You know that. Christy sighed as Anne-Marie went to the bread box in the kitchen. I wish I could have a cupcake, she said. A big yellow cupcake with pink frosting. Her mother laughed. For a little girl, you have a long memory, she told Christy. There hasn't been any butter or sugar for cupcakes for a long time. A year at least. When will there be cupcakes again? When the war ends, Mrs. Johnson said. She glanced through the window down the street corner where the soldiers stood, their faces impassive beneath their metal helmets. When the soldiers leave. Chapter 2. Who is the man who rides past? Tell me a story, Anne-Marie, begged Christy as she snuggled behind her sister in the big bed they shared. Tell me a fairy tale. Anne-Marie smiled and wrapped her arms around her little sister in the dark. All Danish children grew up familiar with fairy tales. Hans Christian Andersen was the most famous of tale-tellers, had been Danish himself. Do you want the one about the Little Mermaid? That one had always been Anne-Marie's own favorite. But Christy said no. Tell me the one that starts with the king and queen. They have a beautiful daughter. All right. Once upon a time there was a king, Anne-Marie began. And a queen, whispered Christy. Don't forget the queen. And a queen. They lived together in a wonderful palace, and was the palace named Amalienborg? Christy asked sleepily. Shh! Don't keep interrupting or I'll never finish. The story. No, it isn't Allenborg. It was a pretend palace. Anne-Marie talked on, making up a story of a king and a queen and their beautiful daughter, Princess Christy. She sprinkled her tale with formal balls, fabulous gold-trimmed gowns, and feasts of pink frosted cupcakes, until Christie's deep sleep, even breathing, told her that her sister was sound asleep. She stopped, waited for a moment, half expecting Christie to murmur, "Then what happened?" But Christie was still. Anne-Marie's thoughts turned to the real King Christian X and the real palace, Amalienburg, where he had lived in the center of Copenhagen. How the people of Denmark loved King Christian. He was not like fairy tale kings who seemed to stand on balconies giving orders to subjects, or who sat on golden thrones demanding to be entertained and looking for suitable husbands for their daughters. King Christian was a real human being, a man with a serious, kind face. She had seen him often when she was younger. Each morning she came from behind the palace on his horse, Jubilee, and ridden alone through the streets of Copenhagen, greeting his people. Sometimes, when Anne-Marie was a little girl, her older sister Liz had taken her to stand on the sidewalk so that she would wave to King Christian. Sometimes he waved back to the two of them and smiled. "Now you are special forever," Lisa had told her once, "because you have been greeted by the king." Anne-Marie turned her head on the pillow and stared through the partially opened curtains of the window into the dim September night, thinking of Lisa. Her solemn, lovely sister always made her sad. So she turned her thoughts again to the king, who was still alive, and Lisa was not. She remembered a story that Papa had told her shortly after the war began, shortly after Denmark had surrendered and soldiers had moved in overnight to take their places on the corners. One evening, Papa had told her that earlier he was on an errand near his office, standing on the corner waiting to cross the street, when King Christian came by on his morning ride. One of the German soldiers had turned suddenly and asked a question of a teenage boy nearby. "Who is that man who rides past here every morning on his horse?" the German soldier had asked. Papa said he had smiled to himself, amused that the German soldier did not know. He listened while the boy answered. "He is our king," the boy told the soldier. "He is the king of Denmark." "Where is his bodyguard?" the soldier had asked. And do you know what the boy had said? Papa asked Anne-Marie. She was sitting in his lap. She was little then, only 7 years old. She shook her head, waiting to hear the answer. The boy looked right at the soldier and he said, "All of Denmark is his bodyguard." Anne-Marie had shivered. It sounded like a very brave answer. "Is it true, Papa?" she asked. "What the boy said?" Papa thought for a moment. He always considered questions very carefully before he answered them. "Yes," he said at last, "it is true. Any Danish citizen would die for King Christian to protect him." "You too, Papa?" "Yes." "And Mama?" "Mama too." Anne-Marie shivered again. "Then I would too, Papa, if I had to." They sat silently for a moment. From across the room, Mama watched them, Anne-Marie and Papa, and she smiled. Mama had been crocheting that evening 3 years ago, the lacy edging of a pillowcase, part of Lisa's trousseau. Her fingers moved rapidly, turning the thin white thread into an intricate, narrow border. Lisa was a grown-up girl of 18 then, about to be married to Peter Nielsen. When Lisa and Peter married, Mama said Anne-Marie and Christy would have a brother for the very first time. "Papa," Anne-Marie had said, finally into silence, "sometimes I wonder why the king wasn't able to protect us. Why didn't he fight the Nazis so that they wouldn't come into Denmark with their guns?" Papa sighed. "We are such a tiny country," he said, "and they are such an enormous enemy. Our king was wise. He knew how few soldiers of Denmark had. He knew that many, many Danish people would die if we fought. In Norway, they fought," Anne-Marie pointed out. Papa nodded. "They fought very fiercely with Norway. They had those huge mountains for the Norwegian soldiers to hide in. Even so, Norway was crushed. In her mind, Amory had pictured Norway as she remembered it from the map at school, up above Denmark. Norway was pink on the school map. She imagined the pink strip of Norway crushed by a fist. Are there German soldiers in Norway now, the same as there are here? Yes, Papa said. In Holland, too, Mama added from across the room, and in Belgium, and in France. But not in Sweden, Amory announced, proud that she knew so much about the world. Sweden was blue on the map, and she had seen Sweden, even though she had never been there. Standing behind Uncle Henrik's house north of Copenhagen, she had looked across the water, the part of the North Sea that was called the Kattegat, to the land on the other side. That is Sweden you are seeing, Uncle Henrik had told her. You are looking across to another country. That's true, Papa had said. Sweden is still free. And now, 3 years later, it was still true. But much else has changed. King Christian was getting old, and he had badly injured last year in a fall from his horse. Faithful old Jubilee, who had carried him around Copenhagen for so many mornings. For days they thought that he would die, and all of Denmark had mourned. But he hadn't. King Christian X was still alive. It was Lisa who was not. It was her tall, beautiful sister who had died in an accident 2 weeks before her wedding. In the blue, carved trunk in the corner of this bedroom, Anne-Marie could see its shape even in the dark, was folded Lisa's pillowcases and their crocheted edges, her wedding dress with the hand-embroidered neckline, unworn, the yellow dress that she had worn and danced in, with its full skirt flying at the party celebrating their engagement to Peter. Mama and Peter never spoke of Lisa. They never opened the trunk, but Amory did, from time to time when she was alone in the apartment. Alone, she touched Lisa's things gently, remembering her quiet, soft-spoken sister who had looked forward so to marriage and children of her own. Red-headed Peter, her sister's fiancé, had not married anyone in the years since Lisa's death. He had changed a great deal. Once, he had been like a fun-loving older brother to Amory and Christy, teasing and tickling, always a source of foolishness and pranks. Now, he still stopped by the apartment often, and his greeting to the girls were warm and smiling, but he was usually in a hurry, talking quickly to Mama and Papa about things Amory didn't understand. He no longer sang the nonsense songs that he had once made Amory and Christy shriek with laughter, and he never lingered any more. Papa had changed, too. He seemed much older and very tired, defeated. The whole world had changed. Only the fairy tales remained the same. And they lived happily ever after, Anne-Marie recited, whispering into the dark, completing the tale for her sister who slept beside her, one thumb in her mouth.